It's 6 and we're just going to bring you some breaking news that we have for you in the last few moments, because it is being reported this morning that Robert Mugabe, the former president of Zimbabwe, has died. He was 95 and he had been ill for some considerable time.
You've seen pictures of him there at the United Nations a few years ago. He was forced from office in 2017, but he had been the president of Zimbabwe for 37 years. He was a fixture on the world stage. He was so prominent on news bulletins over so many years, wasn't he? An irritant for the United Kingdom for so long. He'd been a fighter for independence for Zimbabwe, and he spent, 10 years in prison as well for sedition at one point.
Yeah, and obviously looking back at an incredibly long career, those early successes during his time in office, of course, were then very seriously overshadowed by the significant economic decline of the country he is so intrinsically linked to. We had known he'd been ill for some time. We believe he'd been being treated in a hospital in Singapore for some time, and the reports that we're getting this morning are coming from there. So just to remind you of the breaking news that we've had in the last few moments, that is that Robert Mugabe has died at the age of 95.
He was a notorious figure. He was someone who gripped onto power, was hated by many, and yet some thought he was the kind of leader that Africa needed, a strong leader. Incredibly controversial. We'll be reflecting on his life, his legacy, and bringing you more details of his passing as we come through this morning's programme. In fact, I think we can just pause for a moment now and reflect on the controversial life of Robert Mugabe.
He was once Zimbabwe's liberator, leading a war against white minority rule. But by the end, the adulation President Robert Mugabe once enjoyed was gone. He cemented his power, winning overwhelmingly at elections in 1980. As leader of a new nation, he set about creating a better country than the one he inherited. And for a while, he succeeded.
There can never be any return to the state of armed conflict which existed before our commitment to peace and the democratic process of election under the Lancaster House Agreement. Surely, this is now time to beat our swords into plowshares.
But beneath the veneer lay a dark side. Mr. Mugabe deployed a crack military unit to southern Zimbabwe to deal with hundreds of insurgents. Between 1983 and 1987, thousands were murdered, and the world turned a blind eye. Mugabe was the great hope. But as the 1990s ended, the economy was bottoming out, and a new political party was on the rise. Seemingly desperate to regain popularity, Mr. Mugabe played a political hand. Land seized by the colonial government was still in the hands of the white minority. Sensing the frustration, Mugabe encouraged blacks to take back their land, and they did, often violently. The Western world took note, breaking diplomatic ties and imposing economic sanctions. The opposition, its leaders, human rights workers bore the brunt of his anger. In 2008, in the midst of billion% inflation and widespread unemployment, Mr. Mugabe suffered his first electoral defeat. It only led to more violence in the second round of voting. Britain stripped him of his knighthood, and former allies condemned him.
Nearer to home, we had seen the outbreak of violence against fellow Africans in our own country, and the tragic failure of leadership in our neighboring Zimbabwe.
But he remained a cult-like figure among many Africans for daring to challenge Western political dominance on the world's affairs.
In retaliation for the measures we took to empower the black majority, the United Kingdom has mobilized her friends and allies in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand to impose illegal economic sanctions against Zimbabwe.
But within his own party, discontent was rising. Many believed he had overstayed and needed to hand over power. His second wife, Grace Mugabe, 40 years his junior, seemed to be gaining power, and she began accusing then Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa of trying to oust them. Mr. Mugabe finally fired his longtime aide, accusing him of trying to topple him. Mr. Mnangagwa, with the help of the military, mounted a comeback, posting soldiers on the streets and placing Mr. Mugabe under house arrest. Tens of thousands of Zimbabweans marched, calling on him to step down. And after the threat of impeachment, he resigned. In his last years, Mr. Mugabe had retreated to the seclusion of his mansion. Many will remember him as a gifted orator and visionary who liberated Zimbabwe, but later returned her to the shackles of oppression.
Reflecting on the life and the legacy of Robert Mugabe, former president of Zimbabwe, whose death has been confirmed just in the last few minutes to us here at BBC News.